The ballroom was glowing with golden lights, and the sound of laughter and glasses clinking filled the air. It was a company event, the kind where everyone tried to impress, where the rich and powerful showed off their wealth, and where workers stood a little straighter just because the boss was in the room. At the very center of it all sat the CEO, a man who seemed untouchable. His suit was sharp, his smile confident, and his voice carried through the hall like he owned not just the company but the whole world around him. The CEO was not just a leader of the company. He was known for his pride. People said he could never admit defeat in anything, whether it was business deals, tennis, golf, or even small games. He had money, status, and influence, and with all of that, he had developed a habit of mocking those he thought were beneath him. To him, life was a game, and he believed he was always the winner. On this night, his conversations slowed, and the spotlight seemed to settle on him. The CEO leaned back in his chair, smirked, and spoke loudly. "Enough for everyone to hear. Who here thinks they can beat me at chess?" he said, raising his glass slightly. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some chuckled nervously. Others simply looked down at their feet. The CEO wasn't finished. He stood up, his tall frame commanding the room. "I'll tell you what," he continued, his eyes sparkling with arrogance. "Beat me in chess, and I'll wed you." The words hung in the air, shocking everyone. For a moment, there was silence, then laughter burst out like a wave. The guests laughed, not because they thought the challenge was funny, but because it was absurd. They knew the CEO was a skilled chess player. He had studied the game for years and often bragged about beating professional players. To think that someone in that room could defeat him was laughable. And to think he would offer something as outrageous as marriage if someone did that made the challenge even more ridiculous. The CEO smirked wider, enjoying the attention. He loved being the center of the stage. He loved the way people looked at him, half in admiration, half in fear. He thrived on it. He looked around, scanning the faces of his employees, daring them with his eyes. "Come now," he teased, "surely someone here has the courage. Or are you all too afraid to lose?" The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some whispered to one another, but no one moved forward. Deep down, they all knew it wasn't just about a chess game. It was about pride. Challenge the CEO and lose would mean embarrassment, maybe even career damage. But to win well, no one even considered that possibility. One young manager laughed nervously and said, "Sir, no one here can beat you." The CEO chuckled, nodding in agreement. "Exactly," he replied, his tone dripping with superiority. "That's what I thought." The arrogance in his voice was sharp, but no one dared to correct him. Instead, they clapped lightly, pretending to find the whole thing entertaining. But behind the laughter, some felt the sting of humiliation. The CEO wasn't just boasting about chess. He was reminding everyone of their place. He was up high, untouchable, while they were down below, powerless. For the CEO, it was just another performance. He didn't expect anyone to take his challenge seriously. To him, it was just a way to display his dominance, to show once again that he was unbeatable. He loved the way people's eyes widened at his boldness, loved the way they whispered his name with respect and fear. It fed his ego like nothing else. But as he sipped his drink and let the laughter wash over him, he didn't notice the quiet figure in the back of the hall. A man who had been sweeping floors, clearing tables, and watching silently as the CEO made his boast. Unlike the others, this man wasn't laughing. He wasn't impressed by the CEO's arrogance. He had no wealth, no fine suit, no seat at the decorated tables. But what he did have was something the CEO had underestimated his whole life, a mind sharp enough to change everything. Still, at this moment, the CEO believed he had one already. He believed no one in the room would dare step forward. To him, His arrogant challenge was just another way to remind the world that he was invincible. And so, the ballroom buzzed with laughter and whispers, the guests shaking their heads at the impossible bet. The CEO stood tall, his smirk growing. Stronger, confident that once again he had proven his superiority. What he didn't know was that his challenge, spoken in arrogance, was about to be answered in a way he could never have imagined. Asterisk, the CEO's words echoed in the ballroom like a bell that refused to stop ringing. "Beat me in chess, and I'll wed you." He had said it with such confidence, such casual arrogance, that people didn't know whether to laugh or to stay quiet. The sound of forks on plates slowed. Conversations froze. The orchestra playing. Soft background music seemed to fade away. For a few seconds, the room stood in complete silence. Dozens of faces turned toward the CEO, their eyes wide with surprise. Some of the guests raised their eyebrows. Others glanced at each other as if to confirm whether they had really heard him correctly. A bold challenge, a ridiculous prize, and the unmistakable smirk of a man who believed no one could touch him. Then the laughter began small at first, like little cracks breaking through the silence. One man chuckled nervously. Then a group of women at the back burst into giggles. Soon, half the hall was laughing, though it wasn't the kind of laughter that came from genuine humor. It was awkward, shaky, forced. People weren't laughing at a joke. They were laughing because they didn't know what else to do. The CEO soaked it in, his smirk widening. He loved the reaction. This was exactly what he wanted, to shock them, to entertain them, but most of all, to remind them that he was beyond their reach, yet not everyone was laughing. Some employees kept their eyes down, pretending to check their phones or sip their drinks. Others whispered to each other in disbelief. Did he really say that? He can't be serious. Who would even dare? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke up. The silence that returned after the nervous laughter was heavier than before. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on people's shoulders. The kind that filled the air with invisible tension. The CEO noticed it, and he thrived on it. "What's the matter?" he asked loudly, his voice bouncing against the tall marble walls. "Not one of you has the courage to try." His words stung, not because of the challenge itself, but because of the way he said them. They carried the sharp edge of mockery. He wasn't inviting competition. He was ridiculing everyone for not being on his level. It was as if he had placed himself on a high mountain peak and was now daring them to climb, knowing full well they would fall before even reaching the base. Some of the younger staff exchanged worried glances. A few actually considered it for just a second, but then the reality sank in. To challenge the CEO was to risk humiliation in front of everyone. And worse, losing to him meant confirming his superiority. It meant becoming the subject of his jokes for weeks, maybe months. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the fool who thought they could outsmart the boss and failed miserably. And so the silence grew thicker. Glasses were lifted, but not drunk from. Hands fidgeted with napkins. Feet shuffled uncomfortably under tables. No one wanted to be the first to break the uneasy stillness. The CEO chuckled under his breath, his eyes sweeping across the crowd. He could see their hesitation, their fear, and he enjoyed every second of it. "I thought as much," he said smoothly, almost whispering but loud enough for all to hear. A room full of people, and not one with enough skill, or perhaps not enough bravery. That remark sank deep into everyone's chest. Some clenched their jaws. Others felt their pride sting. But what could they do? They all knew the truth. The CEO was not bluffing about his chess skills. Stories about his games were well known in the company. He had beaten local masters, embarrassed visiting business partners, and even won regional competitions. He studied openings, memorized tactics, and rehearsed strategies like a soldier sharpening weapons for war. Facing him was not just hard-et. was suicide, and then, beneath all the murmurs and shifting gazes, something else filled the room, doubt mixed with curiosity. Not about the CEO, but about themselves. What if someone did step forward? The thought seemed impossible, yet it lingered like a spark waiting for fuel. But no one was brave or foolish enough to turn that spark into fire. Asterisk the CEO raised his glass again, as if sealing the moment with a toast. "Very well," he said with a grin. "I'll drink to my undefeated title." He tilted his head back and sipped, savoring the taste of victory he hadn't even earned. To him, silence itself was proof of his triumph. But not everyone agreed. In the back of the hall, near the edges where the light was dimmer and the polished shoes gave way to worn work boots, someone stood quietly. He had been listening the entire time, his broom leaning against the wall, his calloused hands resting calmly. Unlike the others, he wasn't impressed by the CEO's words. He didn't feel fear pressing down on him. He wasn't blinded by the man's wealth, suit, or authority. To him, it was just a game he knew all too well. While the others drowned in silence, this man's mind was alive with possibilities. His eyes, sharp and observant, followed the CEO not with admiration, but with calculation. Where the others saw an untouchable master, he saw patterns, weaknesses hidden beneath arrogance. Still, he waited. He didn't rush to the table. He didn't crave attention. But deep inside, he knew the silence would not last forever. It would soon be broken not by the CEO, not by the fearful crowd, but by the least expected person in the entire room. For now, the silence stretched on, heavy as iron. The CEO smirked, believing he had already won. The crowd shifted, whispering about the impossible challenge. And in the shadows, a quiet janitor prepared himself for the moment that would change everything. Asterisk the silence in the grand ballroom had stretched so long it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The CEO leaned smugly against his chair, confident that no one would ever step forward. His smirk had already grown into a full smile. The kind of smile that said, "I've already won," without even moving a piece. Around him, the crowd fidgeted, too embarrassed to admit their fear, too timid to rise against his arrogance. And then, from the far edge of the room, a sound broke the stillness. Not the sound of heels clicking on marble floors or the clinking of wine glasses, but the simple scrape of a chair being pushed back. Heads turned slowly, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Who would dare? At first, no one could see clearly. The spotlights were focused on the CEO and his glittering table of executives. But from the shadows emerged a man most of them had never paid attention to. His uniform was plain. His shoes were scuffed from years of wear. A rag was tucked into his belt, and his calloused hands still bore faint marks of cleaning chemicals. It was the janitor. Gasps filled the air like a sudden gust of wind. A few people stifled their laughter, while others openly chuckled. The janitor. The man who mopped their floors and emptied their trash bins. Surely, this was a joke. The CEO raised his eyebrows in amusement. "You," he said, his voice echoing with disbelief. He leaned forward, his smirk curling into a grin. "You think you can beat me?" The janitor didn't flinch. He didn't smile, didn't joke, didn't even look nervous. His eyes were calm, steady, the eyes of a man who had seen too much to be shaken by ridicule. He simply nodded once and said in a low, firm voice, "Yes, I'll play." The laughter grew louder now, rolling across the hall like a wave. Some clapped mockingly, others whispered cruel jokes. This will be over in seconds. He's going to embarrass himself. Why waste the CEO's time? But there was something in the janitor's posture that silenced a few of the wiser guests. He didn't move like someone seeking attention. He didn't act like someone making a foolish gamble. He moved with quiet certainty, like a man who knew exactly what he was walking into. The CEO, enjoying the spectacle, waved a hand toward the chess table set up near the stage. It was there for entertainment, for casual play among guests, never for a serious match. "Very well," he said mockingly. "If this is the best challenger I'll get tonight, then let's not waste time. Come, janitor, let's see what you've got." The janitor walked forward, his footsteps measured and slow. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, heavy with doubt, judgment, and ridicule. But he didn't shrink from it. In his heart, he wasn't thinking about their laughter or the CEO's arrogance. He was only thinking about the board, the pieces, and the game he loved as he approached. A memory flickered in his mind, his grandfather teaching him chess under the dim light of a single lamp. Long nights of practice, endless strategies whispered like secrets, mistakes corrected with patience. To him, chess wasn't just a game. It was discipline. It was memory. It was survival. The janitor pulled out the chair across from the CEO and sat down. The contrast was striking. The CEO in his designer suit, wearing a gold watch that gleamed under the lights, and the janitor in his faded uniform, sitting upright but humble. The board between them became a line dividing two worlds, wealth and power on one side, humility and quiet strength on the other. The CEO leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I'll make this quick," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Laughter erupted again, fueling his confidence. But the janitor didn't respond, his hands folded neatly on the table, his eyes fixed on the chessboard with unwavering focus. For a moment, the noise around them seemed to fade away. The janitor didn't hear the whispers, didn't feel the mocking gazes. All he saw were the squares, the pieces, the patterns he had studied for years. To him, this wasn't about pride, or marriage, or even humiliation. It was about the purity of the game, a battle of minds, where money and status meant nothing. The CEO picked up a white pawn and placed it forward confidently, his smirk still fixed in place. He was sure this would be easy. But as he looked up, he saw something unexpected. The janitor wasn't hesitating. His eyes were sharp, his hands steady as he reached for his first move. There was no nervous trembling, no clumsy pause. His fingers moved with the quiet grace of someone who had played this game countless times before. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some began to sense something unusual. This wasn't the posture of a man blindly hoping for luck. This was the posture of a man who knew what he was doing. Still, the CEO brushed it off. In his mind, the janitor could never match his years of experience. Yet, deep inside, a tiny flicker of doubt began to sparks. He didn't recognize it yet. The janitor's first move was made. It was clean, fast, and precise. The crowd leaned in, curious now. Some frowned, recognizing it as a strong opening. Others whispered, "Maybe he knows what he's doing." The CEO's smirk faltered for just a second, then returned. "Interesting," he muttered. But the janitor didn't respond. His eyes stayed locked on the board, like a soldier in battle, focused only on the enemy's next step. The game had begun. The janitor had stepped forward, not just physically, but mentally, entering a world where status no longer mattered. The crowd might still see him as just a janitor. But on this battlefield of 64 squares, he was something else entirely. And though the CEO didn't yet know it, his downfall had already begun the moment the janitor touched that first piece. Asterisk, the moment the janitor placed his first move, the ballroom exploded, not with respect or curiosity, but with laughter. It was as if someone had cracked the funniest joke of the night. Glasses clinked, hands clapped mockingly, and voices rose above the gentle music. The crowd didn't see a competitor. They saw entertainment. To them, this wasn't a battle of minds, but a comedy show unfolding in real time. The janitor sitting across from the mighty CEO. The very idea was laughable. One executive leaned. over to his colleague and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "What's next?" The janitor running the company. His friend burst out laughing, nearly spilling his wine. Another voice from the back shouted, "Make it quick, boss. Don't be late for dessert." The whole room roared again. But through it all, the janitor didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the board, his breathing calm. He didn't hear the laughter the way they intended him to. To him, it was just noise, meaningless distractions trying to shake his focus. Years of quiet work, years of being invisible, had already trained him to ignore voices that belittled him. The CEO, however, basked in it. He leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms as if he had orchestrated the laughter himself. "See," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Even they know this is pointless." His smirk widened, his confidence soaring higher. To him, the janitor was just a clown who had volunteered to embarrass himself in front of everyone. He moved his piece with a flourish, pausing dramatically to give the crowd time to cheer. They responded as expected, clapping and hollering as if it were a performance on a stage. The CEO thrived on the attention, convinced that the laughter proved his superiority. But then, quietly, almost too quietly for the room to notice, the janitor moved his next piece. There was no show, no arrogance, no hesitation, just precision. His hand returned calmly to the table, his gaze steady on the board. The laughter faltered for half a second. A few people frowned. One man near the front tilted his head, noticing that the janitor's move wasn't random. It was sharp, deliberate, professional. But before he could say anything, the CEO laughed again, covering the small crack in the crowd's confidence. "Don't look so serious," the CEO sneered. "It's just a game. And one you're not going to win." He moved another piece, loud and exaggerated, tapping it against the board before leaning back. The crowd erupted again, clapping as if he had already won. The janitor didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly, studying the board with quiet intensity. His hand hovered briefly, then landed on his piece with certainty. Another move, clean, direct, brilliant. Now the laughter softened. It hadn't died completely, but it wavered like a flame struggling in the wind. A few whispers replaced the chuckles. "Wait, did you see that?" someone murmured. Another leaned closer to the board, trying to follow the play. The janitor's moves were beginning to form a pattern, a strategy that only those with an eye for chess could detect. The CEO noticed too, though he would never admit it. His smirk faltered for the briefest moment before he forced it back into place. He couldn't let the crowd see his doubt. He leaned forward again, determined to crush his opponent quickly. "Don't get any ideas," he said, his voice lower. Now, a hint of irritation creeping in. He made his next move swiftly, perhaps too swiftly, his pride beginning to interfere with his calculation. The janitor responded almost instantly. No pause, no hesitation. His move was sharper than before, slicing through the CEO's early strategy like a blade through silk. The laughter quieted again. A nervous energy spread across the room. People exchanged looks, unsure whether to keep mocking or to start watching seriously. The executives, who had been the loudest in their jeers, now leaned forward in their seats, eyes narrowing at the board. Something wasn't right. This wasn't going the way they had expected. Still, the CEO tried to maintain control of the atmosphere. He chuckled, though it sounded forced now. "Enjoy your little moment," he said dismissively. "It won't last." But deep down, he felt a flicker of unease. The janitor wasn't nervous. He wasn't sweating, fumbling, or second-guessing himself. He was calm, too calm. It was a kind of calmness that came from experience, from knowing exactly where the game was heading. The crowd sensed it too, though they didn't want to admit it. Their laughter grew weaker, replaced by murmurs of curiosity and confusion. One by one, the mocking smiles began to fade, replaced by furrowed brows and pursed lips. And the janitor He sat silently, his face unreadable, his hands steady. For him, the game was just beginning, but the outcome was already clear. He didn't need the crowd's approval, nor the CEO's respect. All he needed were the pieces on the board and the patience to let arrogance collapse under its own weight. By the time the janitor made his third move, the laughter had nearly vanished. The room was caught between disbelief and dawning realization. The janitor wasn't just playing, he was winning. The room had shifted. The laughter that once shook the walls had now thinned into a low murmur. People leaned forward in their chairs, their drinks untouched, their eyes fixed on the board. The janitor sat calmly across from the CEO, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. The CEO, though still wearing his trademark smirk, felt the change in the air. He wasn't blind. He'd noticed the way the janitor's hands moved. Without hesitation, the way his eyes stayed locked on the board with laser focus. Still, he told himself it was nothing. Just nerves hidden under a mask of confidence. I'll crush him in minutes, he thought. Let's begin properly, the CEO declared, his voice loud enough to draw back the attention of those who had begun whispering. He picked up his pawn, the classic first move, E2 to E4. It was clean, strong, and confident. The kind of opening move chess players often made to dominate the center of the board. He slammed it down with a little flourish, making sure the sound of the piece hitting the board echoed through the room. The crowd cheered and clapped as if he had already secured victory. There it is, someone shouted. The boss knows what he's doing. The laughter returned briefly, though weaker than before, like it was forcing its way past a growing sense of unease. All eyes turned to the janitor. Would he stumble? Would he hesitate? Would he give the CEO the satisfaction of watching him squirm under pressure? But the janitor didn't even blink. He leaned forward slightly, studying the move with the calmness of a man watching a familiar scene play out. Then, without a word, he reached for his pawn and pushed it forward C7 to C5. The Sicilian defense, gasps rippled through the crowd. A few who knew chess widened their eyes. It wasn't the move of a beginner. It wasn't random. It was one of the most famous counterattacks in the game, a move used by grandmasters to challenge aggressive openings. The CEO's smirk faltered just for a second. He hadn't expected that. He'd assumed the janitor would fumble, make a clumsy response, or worse, play a childish move that would hand him control immediately. But this was serious. The room shifted again. Whispers grew louder. Oh, wait, that's a strong move, someone muttered. Does he actually know what he's doing? Another leaned forward, eyes narrowing. That's the Sicilian defense, isn't it? The CEO forced a chuckle, waving his hand as if dismissing the tension. Lucky guess, he said, trying to convince himself as much as the audience. He made his next move quickly, determined to reassert dominance. Knight 2, F3. Solid, textbook. He leaned back, glancing at the crowd as if daring them to keep doubting him. But the janitor didn't hesitate. His hand moved almost instantly, sliding his knight to C6. Smooth, controlled. The board was beginning to look less like a casual game and more like a serious duel. Between equals, the murmurs grew stronger. People stopped laughing altogether now. The janitor's moves were too precise, too confident, too deliberate. This wasn't luck. This wasn't guesswork. This was skill. The CEO's smirk thinned. He felt a flicker of irritation. How dare this janitor, this nobody, stand against him with such confidence? This was supposed to be quick, a show for his ego, a game to prove once again that he was untouchable. Instead, it was turning into something he hadn't planned for. A real challenge. Still, his pride wouldn't let him admit it. He leaned forward, moving another piece aggressively, his queen's pawn surging ahead. He looked up at the janitor with narrowed eyes, waiting for him to falter, waiting for him to reveal that this was all a bluff. But once again, the janitor answered smoothly, as though he had seen the move coming long before it was made. His bishop slid forward, developing with precision, defending and preparing all at once. It wasn't just a good move, it was the move of someone who had practiced this scenario countless times. The CEO's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. He didn't show it to the crowd, but inside, unease was beginning to coil in his chest. Each move the janitor made seemed to chip away at his confidence, exposing cracks in the wall of arrogance he had built. Meanwhile, the crowd was no longer mocking. They were silent now, caught in the growing tension. The game was no longer a joke. It was no longer entertainment. It was a battlefield, and they were witnesses to something none of them had expected. The janitor holding his own against the CEO. The janitor sat quietly, his expression calm, his moves sharp and deliberate. He didn't seek the crowd's approval, so he didn't need their respect. His focus was entirely on the game, his mind several moves ahead, already weaving a trap the CEO couldn't see. For the first time in years, the CEO realized he wasn't in control of the room. The laughter wasn't feeding his pride anymore. It had vanished, replaced by silence, replaced by the quiet awe of people watching a storm build. He had started the game with a smirk, but now his jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the board more carefully. The janitor had made his first moves, and in those quiet, deliberate gestures, the entire balance of the evening shifted. The CEO was no longer untouchable. The janitor was no longer invisible. On that board of 64 squares, they were equals or worse. Perhaps the janitor was already a step ahead, and though the crowd couldn't see it clearly yet, the first seeds of the CEO's downfall had been planted. Asterisk, the pieces on the board clicked softly as they moved, but to the people watching, each sound felt louder than the laughter that had once filled the room. The crowd no longer mocked. Their eyes were glued to the table where two men sat across from each other, one a wealthy, powerful CEO dressed in a $1,000 suit, the other a janitor in a faded uniform, calm and steady as stone. At first, the CEO had thought this was a joke, a janitor challenging him. Impossible. But now, as the game stretched on, he could feel a knot tightening in his chest. Every move the janitor made was not only corrected, was sharp, precise, and perfectly timed. He CEO leaned forward, staring at the board with narrowed eyes. He had opened with confidence, his moves rehearsed, polished, the same ones he had used countless times before. But the janitor? The janitor was responding with answers so perfect, it was as if he had written the script himself. The crowd began to whisper, their voices no longer mocking, but tinged with awe. "Look at that," someone said softly. "He's not guessing. He knows." Another leaned closer to his friend, whispering, "That's not luck. That's strategy." The CEO heard them, and the words stung. He gritted his teeth, determined not to let his frustration show. "He's just bluffing," he told himself. Anyone can memorize a few openings. But deep inside, he knew this was no bluff. The janitor sat still, his eyes scanning the board like a hawk. His hands were calm, his breathing even. Every time the CEO moved, the janitor's response came swiftly, as if he had already predicted it long before the piece was touched. It wasn't reaction, it was anticipation. The CEO moved his knight aggressively, trying to unsettle his opponent. But the janitor countered with quiet brilliance, positioning his bishop in a way that cut off the CEO's advance completely. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Jaws tightened, and suddenly people began to realize something shocking. The janitor wasn't just surviving. He was controlling the game. A bead of sweat formed on the CEO's forehead, though the room was cool. He reached for his glass of water, his hand trembling slightly before he steadied it against the table. He looked up at the janitor, expecting a smirk or a smile, but saw nothing. The janitor's face was unreadable. His focus absolute. It was unnerving. The CEO had faced many opponents before, other businessmen, trained players, even champions. They all played with expressions, with pride, with visible effort. But this janitor, he played as if he were at peace, as if every move came naturally, without strain. It was terrifying in its simplicity. The janitor moved another piece. The crowd gasped. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't loud. But to those who understood the game, it was devastating. It was the kind of move that revealed not just knowledge of the present, but foresight of the future. Do you see that? A guest whispered, clutching his friend's arm. He's setting a trap. The CEO's smirk cracked. He hadn't seen it coming. He leaned closer, eyes darting over the board, replaying the moves in his head. How had he missed it? How had this janitor seen it before him? The janitor sat back slightly, his hands folded on the table. He didn't gloat, didn't taunt, didn't even meet the CEO's eyes. His silence was louder than any victory cry. It was the silence of someone who didn't need recognition to prove his worth. The crowd shifted again, where once there had been laughter. Now there was respect. Some clapped softly, others nodded in quiet admiration. The story had flipped. The janitor was no longer the clown of the evening. He was the storm everyone had underestimated. The CEO felt it. For the first time in years, he felt small. His pride screamed at him to fight back, to crush this man, to remind everyone of his superiority. But the board told a different story. His pieces were being cornered, his strategy dismantled. His pride eaten away one move at a time. He tried to regain control, pushing his queen forward with a bold attack. Gasps echoed through the hall at the aggressive move. But the janitor's response was immediate, effortless, sliding his knight into position, blocking the attack and setting up a counterstrike. The CEO froze. His queen, the most powerful piece on the board, was suddenly vulnerable. A murmur of shock swept through the crowd. The janitor had not only defended, he had turned the CEO's move against him. Impossible. The CEO muttered under his breath. But it wasn't. It was skill. Pure, undeniable skill. The janitor leaned forward now, just slightly, his eyes glinting in the light. His voice, calm and steady, broke the silence for the first time since the game began. Check. The word hit, harder than a slap. The CEO's head snapped up, his face paling. He hadn't seen it. He hadn't even considered it. The crowd erupted into gasps and murmurs. The weight of the moment crashing down on everyone at once. The janitor's hidden genius had been revealed. No longer could anyone laugh at him. No longer could anyone doubt. This wasn't a lucky streak. This wasn't a fluke. This was mastery. And as the CEO scrambled to defend, the truth settled heavy on the room like a storm cloud. The janitor wasn't just playing the game. He was rewriting the story. Asterisk, the room had fallen into a heavy silence. The CEO's confident grin had long faded, replaced by a tight jaw and restless eyes. His hand hovered over the board, unsure where to move next. For the first time that evening, he looked less like a proud leader and more like a man cornered. The janitor sat across from him, calm as ever. His breathing was steady, his face expressionless, but his eyes burned with quiet focus. The board between them was no longer just a game. It was a mirror, reflecting everything the crowd hadn't seen before. The arrogance of the powerful and the hidden brilliance of the humble. The CEO finally made his move, pushing a piece forward with unnecessary force. The loud clack of wood against wood sounded almost desperate. Some in the audience winced, not because of the sound, but because they sensed he was slipping. His once polished strategies now looked clumsy, rushed, and unsteady. The janitor studied the move for only a heartbeat before responding. His fingers brushed lightly against a knight, then slid it across the board. The crowd leaned forward, holding their breath. The CEO blinked, confusion flickering in his eyes. Gasps rippled through the hall. Whispers darted back and forth. "What just happened?" one man asked. "He's trapped," another whispered back. The CEO leaned closer, his face paling as he realized the knight's position had cut off a key defense. His queen, his pride, was boxed in, unable to save the pieces around her. The janitor hadn't just blocked him, he had dismantled his strategy entirely. The janitor sat back again, silent, letting the board speak for him. His calmness unnerved everyone. To play so quietly, so assuredly, in front of a laughing crowd and an arrogant opponent, that wasn't just skill. That was mastery. The CEO scrambled, his fingers twitching as he searched for a response. He pushed another piece, trying to free his queen, trying to prove to himself that the game wasn't slipping away. But the move came too late. Without hesitation, the janitor's hand moved again. His bishop glided across the board, landing with a quiet finality. The crowd erupted in shocked cries. "Did you see that?" someone whispered. "He's cornering him?" The CEO's mouth went dry. His eyes darted across the board, searching for escape, but every path was cut off, every line blocked. The janitor had built a cage around him, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left to run. The janitor leaned forward now, his voice steady, but soft, the same voice he had used all his life when people ignored him, underestimated him, or spoke over him. "Check." The word echoed like thunder in the hushed ballroom. The CEO flinched, his hand tightening into a fist. He moved again, desperate, shifting a rook to shield his king. His movements were sharp, almost frantic, as if speed could make up for the mistake, but the janitor was already there. His hand slid across the board, moving his queen into place. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. The king was trapped further, his defenses collapsing. The whispers grew frantic. "It can't be. Not this fast. He's finished. He's finished." The CEO's face burned red. His pride screamed at him to fight, to resist, to find some miracle move. He scanned the board furiously, his breath shallow. But the truth stared back at him in silence. There was nothing left. The janitor's hand reached forward one final time. His knight moved, landing with perfect precision. The board froze. The room froze. And then, in a voice so calm, it cut through the tension like a blade. The janitor spoke the words that shattered the CEO's pride. "Checkmate." The hall erupted not with laughter this time, but with shock. Gasps, shouts, and stunned silence filled the air. Some covered their mouths, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Others leaned back in their chairs, eyes wide as if their entire view of the world had just shifted. 3 moves. That was all it had taken. 3 quiet, deliberate moves to bring down a man who had thought himself unbeatable. The mighty CEO, who had mocked everyone with his arrogance, now sat frozen, staring at the board as if it had betrayed him. The janitor didn't gloat. He didn't smile, didn't raise his arms in triumph. He simply folded his hands and leaned back, his calmness more powerful than any celebration. His silence told the whole story. Greatness doesn't shout, it proves itself. The CEO's throat tightened. His eyes darted from the board to the janitor, then to the stunned faces of his employees. He had promised the room he was invincible, and in just 3 moves. That promise had crumbled into dust. The crowd began to clap, hesitant at first, then louder, building into thunderous applause. Not for the CEO, not for the wealth, not for the arrogance they had endured. The applause was for the man who had swept their floors, carried their trash, and worked in silence. The man who had shown with nothing but his mind and patience. That true power does not wear a suit or carry a title. The CEO sat still, his pride shattered. The janitor simply stood, gave a respectful nod, and stepped back. He didn't need to say another word. The game had said everything for him, and though the evening had begun with arrogance and mockery, it ended with a truth so clear it could never be forgotten. Brilliance can come from the humblest of places, and arrogance can fall in the quietest of moves. The applause shook the walls of the ballroom. It rolled through the air, growing louder and louder, until it felt as if even the chandeliers above were trembling from the force of it. People were standing now, clapping with wide eyes and open mouths. Some looked at the janitor as if seeing him for the very first time. The CEO, however, sat frozen in his chair. His hands rested on the table, but his fingers had gone stiff. His king lay helpless on the board, trapped and humiliated in just 3 moves. The crowd wasn't looking at him anymore. The admiration, the awe, the respect, none of it belonged to him now. It all belonged to the man he had mocked. The man he had dismissed as nothing more than a cleaner of floors. The janitor stood slowly, his movements quiet, his face calm. He didn't raise his arms in triumph. He didn't grin or boast. He simply nodded once, as if the game was no more than a simple task completed. His silence carried more weight than any speech ever could. It told the world that true greatness doesn't need to shout. Proves itself in actions. People whispered to one another. How did he do it? 3 moves. Can you believe it? All these years, and we never knew he was this brilliant. The executives who had laughed the loudest now looked ashamed, their eyes cast down, their cheeks flushed. They had joined in mocking a man who had just shown them a level of intelligence none of them could match. The CEO's pride burned inside him like fire. He wanted to slam his fist on the table, to demand a rematch, to call it a trick. But deep in his chest, he knew the truth. There had been no trick. He had been defeated, plain and simple, by a man he thought beneath him. And worse than the loss was the lesson it carried, a lesson that shattered the image of superiority he had built his entire life around. The janitor turned and began to walk away. His head held neither too high nor too low. He walked like a man who needed no audience, no stage, no praise. The chessboard had spoken for him, and that was enough as he passed through the crowd. People stepped aside, giving him space, their eyes following him with newfound respect. A few even lowered their heads slightly, not in pity, but in honor. For the first time, the janitor was not invisible. He was seen at the front of the hall. The CEO finally stood, his face pale and tight. He tried to force a smile, but it came out thin, almost broken. His voice cracked as he spoke. Well played, he muttered. But the words were hollow, empty. He had never been forced to say them before, and now they tasted bitter on his tongue. The janitor stopped for a moment and looked back. His eyes met the CEO's, not with anger, not with triumph, but with quiet wisdom. He didn't speak, but his gaze said everything. Respect is not given because of money. It is earned by actions. And arrogance always falls to humility in the end. The crowd felt it. The truth hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. They would talk about this night for years to come. Not about the party, not about the CEO's wealth, but about the janitor who defeated arrogance in just 3 moves. Somewhere deep inside, the CEO knew the lesson too. He felt it tearing at him, cracking the pride he had worn like armor. For years, he had measured people by their titles, their wealth, their clothes. But tonight, he had been taught a lesson by someone he never thought worthy of notice. And that lesson cut deeper than any defeat. The ballroom slowly returned to its chatter, but the tone had changed. There was no laughter now, no mockery. Instead, there was respect, quiet, genuine respect. People whispered the janitor's name, asking each other about his past, his life, his story. It was as if the man they had ignored for so long had suddenly become the most important person in the room. As the janitor reached the door, he paused. He didn't look back at the board, at the CEO, or at the applause. He simply gave one final nod to the room and stepped out into the cool night air. Outside, the world was quiet. The stars shone above him, steady and eternal, just like his patience, just like his quiet strength. Inside, the CEO sank back into his chair, staring at the board. The pieces were still there, frozen in their final positions. 3 moves, that was all it had taken. He touched his king with trembling fingers, almost in disbelief. It wasn't the janitor who had humiliated him. It was his own arrogance. He had believed he was untouchable, and that belief had blinded him to the truth. And so, the greatest lesson of the night was not about chess. It was about life. Greatness does not wear expensive suits. It does not sit in corner offices or speak the loudest in the room. Greatness can come from anywhere, even from the man who sweeps the floors when everyone else has gone home. The crowd would never forget. The CEO would never forget. And the janitor. He didn't need to be remembered. He had lived his truth, played his game, and walked away with the quiet dignity of a man who had nothing to prove. The lesson was clear. Arrogance falls quickly. But true brilliance, no matter how humble its source, shines forever.